But if we're going to have a plan for boots on the ground after the war, after Putin has condescended to have a ceasefire, then why not do it now? Just to make this point that it is up to the Ukrainians. I mean, these people wouldn't be there in a war-fighting capacity, right?
To be clear, you're saying that...
Now, there's no logical reason that I can see why we shouldn't send some peaceful ground forces there to show our support, our constitutional support for a free, independent Ukraine. That this is a political thing. It's about whether Ukraine is a free country or not. If it's a vassal state of Russia, which is what Putin wants, then obviously it's up to Putin to decide who comes to his country. If it's not, then it's up to the Ukrainians.
How important is President Zelensky?
And I think that the failure to do anything in Crimea in 2014 was tragic. I think that Putin was emboldened by Western failure in Syria to punish Assad for using chemical weapons. I think that Putin was further emboldened in 2022, in February 2022, by what he'd seen in Afghanistan, and a sort of general sense that the West was on the back foot. We could have solved this problem if we'd been clear about what Ukraine was. We'd continually said to them, you can join NATO and you're on the path to the West, but we never made good that promise. I think if we'd had clarity and simplicity about Ukraine, rather than endless fudge and obscurity, we could have saved that. We could have prevented that invasion.
UK SAS units are on high alert, ready to deploy to Ukraine. Reservists could be called up at any moment. Meanwhile, US is preparing strikes against Iran. Could this spark a wider war, and how far will the West go to support Ukraine? British special forces have been reported on high alert for possible deployment to Ukraine, according to media outlets. Reports from March 2025 indicated that the units were preparing for potential peacekeeping mission with readiness checks on personnel and equipment. This alert was tied to broader Ukraine-European planning for a multinational force that could be sent to help enforce ceasefire. UK Ministry of Defense has not confirmed these reports, citing operational security, but earlier reporting has suggested that special forces could play a role if deployment becomes necessary. Scott Lucas, professor of international politics at the University College Dublin's Clinton's Institute, offered his assessment of Johnson's remarks about deployment troops and the broader question of whether Western troops could be deployed to Ukraine.
I don't think we're close to a deal. I wish I could say we were close to a deal. How I hope, for the sake of everyone in Ukraine, and indeed, people in Russia who've suffered from this, that we're close to a deal, but I don't see it happening. I do think Ukraine wants to keep the talks going. I think Europe wants to keep the talks going because you want to show that you are willing to reach this settlement, to end the Russian invasion. But let me start with the specifics and then make the wider point. The specifics is that if you talk about the military points, or what Zelensky referred to as the military group, the Russians and Ukrainians could sit down and they could say, okay, if we reach a ceasefire, here's the way that we monitor the ceasefire. And so that's what they were doing last week in Geneva. They were talking about the technical discussions of monitoring. Even that has some issues. Russia does not want any Europeans involved in monitoring the ceasefire. Ukraine definitely does. But at least Zelensky could say, all right, the military group made progress. But of course, that's only if we get a ceasefire. And that's when you have to go to the political group. And Zelensky said there's no progress there. None. And indeed, he got really frustrated. You will have seen this on social media, Daniel, when he said, using some fairly crude words, the Russians should stop giving us historical lessons, right? And this is this theme that whenever Vladimir Putin or one of his officials, like Mr. Medinsky last week in Geneva, they go into these long historical rambles of how Ukraine is really part of Greater Russia. Well, that's not the way that you reach into the invasion, because Ukraine does not consider itself to be part of Greater Russia. So stop talking about the 14th and 15th century or even earlier about this. And what was clear is that Medinsky, on behalf of the Kremlin, was not talking about specific compromises, as you put it, on the key issues. And just, I think probably there's still 4 issues that are there. I think one is the fate of Donetsk in eastern Ukraine. I think the proposal now from Ukraine is quite right, that, you demilitarize it. Ukraine pulls back from troops, at least from the area that it controls, about 22%. Russia pulls back troops from the areas it controls. You get a demilitarized zone. That reduces the threat of a renewed invasion. Russia won't accept that. That's just where we are on Donetsk. Secondly, on the wider security guarantees, Russia doesn't want Ukraine to have substantial security guarantees. They want Ukraine to remain not only neutral, but vulnerable. And so a lasting security guarantee in terms of air power to deter the Russians, in terms of troops on the ground to deter the Russians, Moscow is going to fight against that. Third, Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. It's Ukraine's nuclear power plant. Ukraine's nuclear power plant, not the Russians' plant, but they currently occupy it, so they're trying to seize it. And fourthly, I think, where's your priority? Is it on Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction? Or is it on these U.S.-Russian economic projects, that Russia's hoping Donald Trump's envoys will agree to? And the priority has to become on recovery and reconstruction with a very clear timetable, including possibly the use of those frozen Russian assets. Those 4 issues aren't getting resolved. And now I'm going to make the wider point, which is this is Vladimir Putin's legacy. He went into Ukraine in February 2022 and sparked off global consequences because he wanted to conquer Ukraine. If he does not get all of Donetsk, he has failed. He's got Luhansk. He's got part of the south. He's got part of Donetsk, but he hasn't even got all of it. So he hasn't gotten Kyiv. He hasn't gotten rid of the Zelensky government. He doesn't have all of Donetsk, and he's going to go back with Russia taking up to 1.4 million casualties and try to portray this as his legacy. No, that's not what he wants. So until you convince Putin he cannot have that legacy, you don't get an agreement. And that shifts us to the question, which is, under what conditions will Putin back off of that? Under which conditions will he give up trying to take Donetsk? And will he give up trying to keep Ukraine weak and getting rid of the Zelensky government? And that shifts the conversation back from the talks, back to air defenses, back to supporting Ukraine financially, supporting the government in terms of delivering services, and it brings it back to supporting Ukraine's attacks on Russia inside the country.
Meanwhile, Ukraine and its Western allies have agreed on a framework that lays out how they would respond if Russia violates a future ceasefire deal, according to Financial Times. The report says the plan creates a multinational response system designed to deter Moscow. Under the framework, European forces would play a leading role in this response, with US military backing available if violations continue or escalate. The plan includes a coordinated timeline for action. If Russia breaches a ceasefire, Western allies would begin joint response within 72 hours. The first step would involve assessing the violation and applying diplomatic and political pressure. If Russia continues its actions or if its breach is deemed serious, allied forces could then move to deploy under broader structure. The framework stops short of an automatic large-scale military intervention. Instead, it outlines a phased approach in which the scale of Western response would depend on the severity and persistence of any Russian violation. The idea, according to the report, is to send a clear signal that breaches would carry consequences while avoiding escalation. The plan is part of broader efforts by US and Europe for defined security guarantees for Ukraine, as discussions about a potential ceasefire continue. Western officials have sought to demonstrate unity and deterrence while also limiting the risk of direct NATO involvement. Russia has not agreed to the proposed framework. Russian officials have rejected the prospect of foreign troops operating inside Ukraine and have warned that such forces would be treated as legitimate targets. Meanwhile, U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff said new talks aimed at ending the war in Ukraine could take place within the next 3 weeks, raising the possibility of a future meeting between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. In an interview on Fox News, Witkoff said recent diplomatic efforts have created momentum toward another round of negotiations. He said any potential summit, including President Trump, would depend on whether there is a realistic chance of progress. Witkoff describes the conflict as war centered on territory and said he is hopeful the discussions could produce positive insight. He also defended his meeting with Putin, saying the Russian leader had been direct about his position during the talks. Following the recent meeting in Geneva, including US, Ukrainian, and Russians, Witkoff said there had been significant progress and that all sides agreed to continue negotiations and keep their leaders informed. His outreach has faced criticism from some US lawmakers who argue that direct engagement with Moscow risks giving Russia leverage. Witkoff has said dialogue is necessary to test whether a negotiated settlement is possible. Meanwhile, US is increasing military pressure on Iran amid rising tensions over its nuclear program and regional activity. Recent reports indicate US forces in the Middle East are positioned for potential action even as diplomatic talks continue. Satellite imagery and official statements show buildup of US fighter jets, aircraft, and other assets. Former Pentagon officials have said these forces are prepared for a highly kinetic campaign. Analysts say the positioning reflects both deterrence and readiness. US planners have reportedly developed a range of options, include strikes against Iranian military installations or nuclear facilities, as well as operations aimed at senior Iranian officials, though such plans remain speculative and have not been formally confirmed. Some reports also suggest that extended air campaign lasting several days or weeks are being considered using both land and carrier-based aircraft. Diplomatic efforts continue alongside military preparations. US and Iranian officials are meeting for talks in Geneva, mediated by Oman, in an effort to resolve the nuclear standoff. The special envoy Steve Witkoff noted that President Trump has warned of consequences if Iran does not reach a deal. Iran has warned that any US strike would prompt retaliation against US troops. Russia and other actors have also cautioned that military action could escalate. The combination of active diplomacy and visible US military presence underscores the dual approach Washington is taking, maintaining channels for negotiations while preparing for possible military action if Iran does not comply with international demands. This reporting reflects the latest public information from sources including Financial Times, Reuters, New York Times, and other credible US media outlets. That's all for today. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and glory to Ukraine.